Imagine a landscape that looks nothing like the marble city we envision today. Before the Colosseum, before the Grand Forums, and before the emperors, Rome was a collection of mud hut villages clinging to the tops of 7 hills. Below those hills lay a death trap, a valley of stagnant, malaria-ridden swamps fed by the flooding Tiber River. This is the story of how the Romans didn't just build a city, they conquered nature itself. To become a superpower, they first had to go underground. The Great Drain, the Cloaca Maxima. Our story begins with a king of Etruscan origin, Tarquinius Priscus. He looked at the swampy valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, the area that would one day be the Roman Forum, and saw potential where others saw a wasteland. But to use the land, he had to dry it. Thousands of laborers were forced into the mud. They began digging a massive trench, a feat of engineering that would become the Cloaca Maxima, or the greatest sewer. This wasn't just a gutter. It was a vaulted stone tunnel so large that ancient historians claimed a wagon loaded with hay could pass through it. As we drain the oceans and peel back the layers of the modern city, we see the sheer scale of this work. Using volcanic stone known as tufa, Roman engineers created a gravity-fed system that pulled the water out of the swamps and dumped it into the Tiber. This was the moment the heart of Rome was born. The Forum, the center of global power for centuries, literally stands on reclaimed swampland made possible by this hidden tunnel. The secret weapon, Roman concrete. But draining the land was only half the battle. Rome was a city of water, and water destroys stone. How did their structure survive for 2,000 years? As the documentary reveals through digital scans, the Romans discovered a miracle recipe. They looked to the volcanoes. By mixing volcanic ash from Potswali with lime and small pieces of rock, they created opus caementitium, Roman concrete. Unlike modern concrete, which decays in seawater, Roman concrete possessed a chemical secret. When mixed with salt water, a rare mineral called aluminous tobermarite would grow within the cracks, actually making the structure stronger over time. The concrete harbor. In this chapter of history, we see this technology put to the ultimate test at the water's edge. To feed a growing population, Rome needed a port. However, the Italian coast lacked natural harbors. The solution? They built them out of nothing. Workers lowered massive wooden frames into the sea. They poured their volcanic concrete, mixed directly into the water. Instead of dissolving, the concrete hardened instantly, creating massive breakwaters that could withstand the fury of the Mediterranean. The result? A city unbound. Because of these invisible foundations, the sewers beneath the streets and the concrete beneath the waves, Rome was no longer a regional village. They had created a man-made environment. By controlling the water, they could support a population of 1 million people, a number no other city would reach for another 1,800 years. When you walk the streets of Rome today, you're walking on the victory of engineering over the elements. The birth of a superpower wasn't just about soldiers and swords. It was about the men who went into the mud to build a foundation that would never wash away. The rise of the empire began not with a crown, but with a drain. For centuries, Rome was a master of the soil, not the sea. Its soldiers were legends of the infantry, but the Mediterranean belonged to someone else, Carthage. The Carthaginians were the undisputed kings of the waves, possessing a navy that had dominated trade and warfare for generations. Rome was a land animal, and Carthage was a sea monster. But as Rome's ambition grew, it realized a hard truth. To rule the world, you must first rule the waves. This is the story of a military miracle. The moment Rome transformed from a city of farmers into the greatest naval power on earth. The captured blueprint. The revolution began with a stroke of luck and an act of extreme desperation. Legend tells us that a Carthaginian quinquereme, a massive warship with 5 banks of oars, ran aground on the Italian coast. To the Romans, this ship was an alien technology. They didn't just burn it, they dismantled it. In a feat of reverse engineering that changed history, Roman carpenters used the captured ship as a template. In an incredible display of industrial might, Rome reportedly built a fleet of 100 warships in just 60 days. While the ships were being built, thousands of soldiers sat on wooden benches on dry land, practicing the rhythm of rowing in the sand. They were preparing for a war they didn't yet know how to fight. The Corvus, changing the rules. When the Roman fleet finally met the Carthaginians at sea, they were technically inferior. The Carthaginian sailors were faster and more experienced at ramming ships. Rome knew they couldn't win a traditional sea battle, so they changed the rules of engagement. They invented the Corvus, the Raven. It was a heavy, pivoting boarding bridge with a massive iron spike at the end. As a Carthaginian ship approached to ram, the Romans would swing this bridge around and drop it onto the enemy deck. The spike would bite deep into the wood, locking the two ships together. Suddenly, a sea battle became a land battle. The Roman legionnaires, the best hand-to-hand fighters in the world, would swarm across the bridge. By draining the oceans of their mystery, we see the remains of these brutal encounters. The bronze rams, the rostra, lying on the seafloor near the Egadi Islands, marking the spot where Carthaginian dominance died. The industrialization of war. What we see in the wreckage is the first evidence of mass-produced warfare. The bronze rams found by underwater archaeologists are inscribed with Roman stamps, proving they were manufactured under strict state control. Rome had turned shipbuilding into an assembly line. They weren't just building boats, they were building a system. They developed specialized transport ships for horses, supply vessels for grain, and heavy cruisers for combat. This naval revolution allowed Rome to project power across thousands of miles. The Mediterranean was no longer a barrier, it was a highway. The legacy of the Mare Nostrum. By the end of the First Punic War, the sea monster of Carthage had been broken. Rome had survived devastating storms that sank hundreds of their own ships, but they simply kept building more. Their psychological refusal to accept defeat, combined with their engineering genius, gave them total control of the sea. From this point forward, the Romans called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea. The naval revolution was complete. Rome was no longer just a power in Italy. It was now an empire of the world, held together by the timber, bronze, and blood of its invincible fleet. By the height of the empire, Rome had a problem that no city in history had ever faced. It had become the first metropolis to reach a population of 1 million people. But there was a catch. The Italian peninsula could not grow enough grain to feed them. The city was a heartbeat away from starvation at any given moment. If the grain ships from Egypt and North Africa stopped arriving, the empire would collapse into riots and chaos. To prevent this, the emperors realized they needed more than just a navy. They needed the greatest engineering project in the ancient world. They needed Portus, the emperor's vision, creating a coastline. The natural mouth of the Tiber River was too shallow and silted for the massive grain freighters. For years, ships had to anchor in the open sea, dangerously exposed to storms, while small boats ferried the cargo to shore. It was slow and deadly. Emperor Claudius, and later Trajan, decided to do the impossible. They would build a harbor where nature had failed to provide one. As we drain the oceans, near modern-day Fiumicino, a ghost city emerges. They dug nearly 200 hectares of land out of the Italian soil and flooded it to create an artificial basin. But Trajan went further, building a perfect, massive hexagonal basin lined with docks, warehouses, and palaces. The hexagon, an engineering masterpiece. Looking down from a bird's-eye view, the hexagonal shape of Portus was a stroke of genius. It maximized the docking space, allowing hundreds of ships to moor simultaneously, while the shape helped dissipate the energy of incoming waves, keeping the water inside, as still as a pond. Digital scans reveal the sheer scale of the warehouses, or haria. These were not mere sheds. They were multi-story complexes designed with raised floors to allow air to circulate, keeping the precious grain dry and free from rot. This was the stomach of Rome. Here, the wealth of the world, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, silk from the East, and marble from Africa, was unloaded by a small army of dockworkers known as sicariae. The super ships, the honoraria. To fill this port, the Romans built the tankers of the ancient world, the honoraria. These were massive, broad-bellied merchant ships capable of carrying up to 1,200 tons of grain in a single trip. Using underwater archaeology, we can see how these ships were built with mortise and tenon joints, creating a hull so strong it acted like a single piece of wood. They were powered by a sophisticated system of sails, including a small forward sail called the artemon, which allowed these giants to be steered with surprising precision into the narrow entrance of the megaport. The lighthouse and the signal. At the entrance stood a lighthouse that rivaled the Great Pharos of Alexandria. It was built on the remains of a sunken supership that had been filled with concrete to act as a foundation. From its peak, a fire burned 24/7, a beacon of hope for sailors who had spent weeks at sea. When a captain saw that light, he knew he had reached the safety of the empire's embrace. The arrival of the Classis Annoni, the grain fleet, was a day of national celebration. The legacy of logistics. The megaport of Portus was the ultimate proof of Roman dominance. It showed that the empire wasn't just built on soldiers, but on sailors, merchants, and engineers. They had mastered the art of logistics, ensuring that despite the distance, Rome would never go hungry. This infrastructure was the silent engine of the empire. Without these artificial harbors and the brave merchant mariners who sailed them, the eternal city would have been nothing more than a memory in the sand. To the Romans, power was not just about winning a battle. It was about the physical manifestation of authority. When the empire expanded into the eastern Mediterranean, to the shores of modern-day Israel, they faced a coastline that was straight, shallow, and battered by the full force of the sea. There was no natural place for a Roman fleet to anchor. But Rome did not accept the limitations of geography. If the land did not offer a harbor, they would build one into the deep sea. This is the story of Caesarea Maritima, a city of stone built upon the waves, and a testament to how Rome used engineering as a psychological weapon to dominate its frontiers. The impossible port, commissioned by Herod the Great as a tribute to Emperor Augustus, Caesarea was the most ambitious underwater construction project of the ancient world. Engineers faced a nightmare. They had to build massive breakwaters in water that was 15 meters deep, directly against the crushing force of the Mediterranean swells. The secret, once again, lay in the drained evidence of Roman concrete. But here, they used a new technique. Divers, men who could hold their breath for minutes at a time, lowered massive wooden boxes, or caissons, to the seafloor. These boxes were filled with dry volcanic ash and lime. As the seawater seeped in, a chemical reaction occurred, and the mixture hardened into a solid stone block weighing tons. This was the first time in history that a major structure was built entirely underwater on such a scale. The sunken fortress. As we scan the seabed today, we see the remains of these massive breakwaters, which stretched for nearly half a kilometer into the ocean. They weren't just walls, they were fortresses. On top of these concrete foundations, the Romans built towers, warehouses, and even a temple to Augustus that could be seen from miles out at sea. Entering Caesarea was meant to be an overwhelming experience. For a local merchant or a visiting diplomat, seeing a Roman city rising directly out of the deep blue water was a message. The people who built this can control the very elements. Resistance is futile. The frontier mentality. This wasn't just happening in the East. Across the empire, from the rain-soaked shores of Britain to the Danube River in Central Europe, Roman engineers were projecting power. They built bridges over unbridgeable rivers in weeks, like Julius Caesar's famous Rhine Bridge, and constructed coastal forts that served as both customs houses and military garrisons. In these frontier outposts, the Romans brought their lifestyle with them. Digital reconstructions show that even in these remote, sunken fortresses, there were bathhouses with heated floors and theaters for entertainment. By Romanizing the landscape, they turned hostile frontiers into stable provinces. The warning of the waves. However, Caesarea also tells a story of the empire's struggle. Today, the great port of Herod lies mostly underwater. Not because the sea level rose, but because the massive weight of the Roman concrete actually caused the geological shelf beneath it to slump and sink. The very power the Romans used to conquer the sea eventually became too heavy for the earth to hold. These sunken ruins serve as a haunting reminder. Roman power was monumental, but even the strongest concrete is subject to the forces of time and nature. The reach of Rome. In this chapter of the empire's rise, we see that the frontiers were not just lines on a map. They were active construction sites where the Roman identity was forged in stone and hydraulic cement. By mastering the edges of the world, Rome ensured that no matter how far a traveler went, they were always under the watchful eye of the emperor. To understand the Roman Empire, you cannot only look at its soldiers or its grain silos. You must look at its heart, the desire for a life of unprecedented luxury and beauty. At the height of its power, the Roman elite created a playground that was the envy of the ancient world, the city of Baiae. Located on the Gulf of Naples, Baiae was the Las Vegas of the Roman Empire. It was a place of sprawling villas, heated marble baths, and decadence. But today, much of this city lies 6 meters below the surface of the Mediterranean. As we drain the oceans for the final time, we find the ultimate evidence of Rome's architectural legacy, a world where the boundaries between land and sea simply vanished. The architecture of ambition. The ruins of Baiae, now an underwater archaeological park, reveal a level of engineering that seems impossible for the ancient world. Digital scans show villas built on artificial terraces that pushed out into the sea. The Romans weren't content with a view of the ocean. They wanted to live on it. They used their mastery of hydraulic concrete to build submerged fish ponds where they raised exotic seafood for their banquets. They diverted natural volcanic steam through ceramic pipes to create the world's first saunas and heated swimming pools. In Baiae, architecture was no longer about survival. It was about the total mastery of comfort. When we look at these sunken mosaics and marble statues today, we see a civilization that had reached the absolute peak of its technical and artistic ability, the blueprint of the modern world. But the legacy of Rome is more than just sunken statues. The innovations we have explored, the sewers of the Forum, the naval assembly lines, the hexagonal ports, and the deep-sea concrete, became the blueprint for the modern world. Every time you walk into a stadium, you are using Roman architectural logic. Every time a ship enters a modern concrete harbor, it is relying on a chemical formula perfected 2,000 years ago. The Romans taught us how to live in a globalized society. They proved that with enough engineering will, you could connect distant continents, feed millions of people, and turn a swamp into the capital of the world. The weight of empire. The tragedy of Baiae is that its beauty was its undoing. The same volcanic activity that provided the heat for their baths and the ash for their concrete eventually caused the ground to sink through a process called bradyseism. The land literally exhaled, and the city slid into the waves. This serves as a powerful metaphor for the empire itself. The very things that made Rome great, its massive scale, its heavy infrastructure, and its relentless expansion, eventually became a burden too heavy to sustain. The architecture beyond the waves is a reminder that while empires may fall and cities may sink, the ideas they leave behind are immortal. Conclusion. The eternal spirit. As the water recedes in our digital reconstruction, we see the Roman Empire not as a collection of old ruins, but as a living, breathing machine of stone and water. It was a superpower built on the belief that there was no river that couldn't be bridged, no sea that couldn't be crossed, and no nature that couldn't be tamed. The rise of the Roman Empire was the triumph of the human mind over the physical world. From the darkest sewers to the most sun-drenched coastal villas, the Romans built a foundation that still supports our modern civilization today. They didn't just build for their time, they built for eternity. And though the waves now crash over the halls of Baiae, the echoes of Roman genius continue to shape every city we build and every shore we conquer.